Mister, Mama said we are too expensive to keep. Do you know anyone who wants us?
Imagine standing barefoot on a Chicago sidewalk in January. The wind off Lake Michigan doesn't just bite. It decides things about you. It finds the gaps in whatever you're wearing, and it stays there, like it wants to teach you something about how small you are. Your dress is one size too small. Someone told you that would motivate you to eat less. Your sister zipped it this morning, and it left a bruise on your ribs. 2 inches long. You know exactly how long it is because you measured it. You and your sister measure everything now. Bruises, miles, hours, the number of blocks between the drop point and the place you sleep. You measure things because measuring makes you feel like you have some control over what happens to your body. Now imagine a black armored sedan rolls to a stop beside you on a street where the streetlights have been broken for 6 months and nobody filed a report. The window rolls down slowly. A man inside looks at you. He has the kind of face that makes rooms go quiet without him saying a word. He looks like someone who has never once been told no and believed it. You lean toward the window, and you ask him, "Mr. Mama said we are too expensive to keep. Do you know anyone who wants us?" The man goes completely still. Not because the question is strange, because these little girls are not crying when they ask it. They have already given up crying. And he recognizes that look, because he once saw it in the mirror. If you need to know what happens to these 2 little girls, and what the ghost of Chicago does next, subscribe and hit the bell right now. Because this story does not slow down. The night Seojun found them, he wasn't looking for anything. That was the thing about it. He had been doing what he always did on Tuesday nights, moving through the south side in the back of his car, quiet, watching the city the way other men watched clocks. His driver knew the route. His men knew not to speak unless spoken to. Chicago outside the tinted glass was dark and indifferent, and exactly the way he preferred it. Then the headlights caught them. 2 small figures at the mouth of a broken alley, standing close together, the way people stand when they are trying to share warmth and neither one has enough to offer. He almost told his driver to keep moving. He had trained himself for years not to stop for things that weren't his problem. He still doesn't fully understand why he got out of the car. The girls didn't run when he approached. That was the first thing that struck him. Children ran from men who looked like him. These 2 stood perfectly still and watched him cross the distance between them with calm, measuring eyes, like they had already calculated every possible outcome of his arrival and decided none of them were worth the energy of fear. The older one spoke first. "Mister, Mama said we are too expensive to keep. Do you know anyone who wants us?" He stopped. He looked at them. Really looked. Their coats were the wrong weight for January. Their shoes, one of them had a split sole held together with what looked like packing tape. And there, visible above the neckline of the smaller girl's dress, a bruise. Dark. Precise. He recognized precision in damage. It meant someone had been keeping track. "How old are you?" he said. It didn't come out as a question. 8, the older one said. "Both of us." He opened the car door. Neither girl moved immediately. The younger one looked at the open door, then up at him. Her voice was very small and very serious. "Are you going to give us back?" He looked at her. He didn't answer. Because standing there in the January dark with the lake wind cutting through everything, Seojun, the ghost of Chicago, the man who had never once hesitated in his adult life, genuinely did not know. His housekeeper didn't ask questions. That was why he trusted her. She took one look at the girls, pulled them into the safe house kitchen, and had warm food in front of them within 15 minutes. Seojun stood in the doorway and watched. The older twin, he didn't know their names yet, ate methodically, small bites, deliberate chewing, like someone who had learned not to trust that the plate would stay in front of her. The younger one watched every adult in the room before she reached for anything, a small, careful survey, checking for the thing that would change the temperature. He recognized that, too. He stepped into the hallway and called his intelligence contact. 2 girls, 8 years old, identical twins, running somewhere on the south side. I need everything. The answer came back in under an hour. He read it standing by the window with the city spread out below him, and for the length of time it took to read 3 paragraphs, Han Seojun felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that lived just below anger and just above grief. The girls had been running courier routes through Chicago for 8 months. Encrypted drives, financial keys, illegal data packages sewn into the lining of their coats. They walked the routes at night mostly, sometimes early morning. Bronzeville, the Loop Corridor, the stretch under the L tracks where the noise covered everything. They knew the city the way people knew it when they had no choice but to learn it. Not as a place to live in, as a system to survive. His housekeeper appeared at his shoulder. "The little one has bruising on her ribs," she said quietly. "Both of them do. Same place, same shape." "I know," he said. "Seojun." She only dropped the title when she needed him to actually hear her. "Someone measured those bruises. They wrote it down. I found a small notebook in the older girl's coat pocket. They've been logging them. Dates, sizes, which side." He was quiet for a long time. Children who logged their own damage were children who had been told their pain wasn't important enough for anyone else to track. So they tracked it themselves. So at least someone was keeping record. He looked back at the contacts report. At the bottom, a final line. One name. The person who designed the courier routes. Who selected the carriers. Who decided that 2 8-year-old girls were the cleanest solution to a logistics problem. The name was Elder Han, his uncle. The man Seojun had protected, defended, and shielded from consequences his entire adult life. He set the phone face down on the windowsill. Outside, Chicago offered nothing. No reaction, no apology, just the distant glitter of the lake and the indifferent geometry of the skyline. His contact sent one final message. "There's more. Call me when you're ready." He didn't call back that night, because he already knew whatever came next was going to require him to be a different kind of ready than he currently was. The port of Chicago sat heavy and industrial along the Calumet River, the kind of place that smelled like rust and cold water and decisions that couldn't be walked back. Elder Han ran his legitimate front out of a shipping office on the east side of the port. Clean paperwork, cooperative inspectors, a receptionist who smiled like she didn't know what moved through the building after hours. Seojun arrived without calling ahead. Elder Han didn't look surprised. He gestured to the chair across from his desk the way a man gestured to furniture he owned, and Seojun sat because standing would have made the anger visible, and he wasn't ready to show it yet. "The girls," Seojun said. "Are fine, I assume, since you have them," Elder Han said. He folded his hands. "They're assets, Seojun. Efficient, invisible. No one stops children. They're 8 years old. Children have been used in every operation since operations existed. I didn't invent the logic. I applied it." Seojun looked at him for a long moment. The man across from him had silver at his temples and the particular stillness of someone who had never once second-guessed a decision. He looked reasonable. He looked like someone's respected elder. He looked like the man who taught Seojun how to read a contract and how to recognize when someone was lying by the way they held their shoulders. "Return them," Elder Han said. His tone didn't change. "And this doesn't become a problem between us." "It's already a problem between us." "Seojun," Elder Han leaned forward slightly. "You of all people should understand this. You were useful before you were loved. I put you in rooms before anyone knew your name. I handed you opportunities that required you to perform, not to feel. And look at what you became." A pause. "At least I'm honest about what I'm doing. You built your empire the same way. You just found cleaner language for it." The office was very quiet. Seojun stood, buttoned his coat, looked at his uncle one final time. He left without another word. In the car, his driver didn't speak. The city moved past the windows. He kept his hands flat on his knees the entire drive back, because they wanted to do something he hadn't decided on yet. When he walked into the safe house, Minha was sitting at the kitchen table. In front of her, a notebook. Open. Dense, careful handwriting. Addresses, street names, drop points, times. 8 months of routes mapped out in the handwriting of an 8-year-old who had decided that information was the only protection she had left. She looked up at him. Her eyes were calm and very old for her face. She slid the notebook across the table. "In case you need it," she said quietly. "In case you decide to send us back." He found Sora at 2 a.m., sitting on the window seat in the hallway, watching the street below. She wasn't scared. She wasn't crying. She was watching the street the way his scouts watched intersections, cataloging, filing, building a picture from pieces. He stood in the hallway for a moment before she heard him, and in that moment, he understood that this child had spent 8 months training herself to see the city as data. He sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Chicago hummed distantly below. A cab moved through the intersection. Someone's window glowed 3 floors up across the street. Then Sora started talking. Not about the addresses, not about the drives or the drop points, about what she noticed. The man on Wabash who stood outside the same building every Tuesday night and always looked away when she passed. Always. Like looking away was something he owed her. The woman near the Garfield L stop who once pressed a hand warmer into Sora's palm without making eye contact and then walked away crying quietly into her coat collar. The night in February when Minha's shoe split open 2 miles from the drop point and they walked the rest of the route on bare January concrete because going back wasn't an option and stopping wasn't either. She told it without drama, without tears, like someone delivering a briefing. Seojun listened to all of it. Then he asked her one question. "Were you ever scared?" Sora considered this seriously, the way she considered everything, with the full weight of a person who had learned that wrong answers had costs. "I stopped," she said finally. "Minha said it cost too much." Seojun stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. Chicago in the deep hours of the night, indifferent and glittering, full of people sleeping through things they would never know happened 6 feet from where they dreamed. And something behind his eyes, something he had kept sealed and load-bearing for 20 years, broke quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gave way. The way ice gave way in late March on the edges of the lake, without announcement, simply no longer able to hold the weight of the season. If this story is hitting different right now, subscribe and hit the bell. You do not want to miss what Minha reveals next. 3 days after the conversation with Sora, Seojun found Minha in the kitchen before sunrise. She was already dressed, already had tea made, not for herself but waiting for him, like she had calculated the time he would appear. He sat down across from her and she looked at him with those 2 old eyes, and he understood she had been waiting to tell him something. "I made a deal with him," she said. "With Elder Han." He waited. 2 extra routes per week. I told him I would do them without complaint. No mistakes, no delays. She wrapped her hands around her mug. In exchange, Sora never went out alone at night. Ever. He agreed because 2 extra routes from me was worth more to him than the risk of Sora getting lost or stopped without backup. The kitchen was very quiet. Seojun looked at this 8-year-old child who had walked into a negotiation with one of the most dangerous men in Chicago and come out with a binding agreement, an agreement she had held him to for months, silently, without anyone knowing. She hadn't protected her sister with tears. She hadn't protected her with hope. She had protected her with strategy, with leverage, with the only currency anyone around her had ever accepted. She had built her own operation inside his operation. "Minha," he said carefully. "Does Sora know?" She shook her head. "She thinks I just worked harder." A pause. Not sad, just factual, the way she said everything. "She thinks the extra routes were random. Reassignments." She looked at him directly. "Are you going to tell her?" He held her gaze. "Let her keep thinking that," she said, before he could answer. "She's just starting to stop being scared. If she finds out she was the reason—" Minha stopped. Something moved briefly across her face, the only crack in the composure. "Let her have that." Seojun sat with that for a long time. This child had carried the weight of her sister's safety on routes through Chicago winter and filed it under working harder so that Sora could have the small, fragile luxury of not knowing what it cost. He thought about his uncle's voice in the port office. You were useful before you were loved. He thought about Minha at 8 years old, walking into that office, offering more of herself so her sister could be protected. The difference, he thought, was everything. The difference was the whole point. The message came through back channels at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Seojun read it once. It was brief and precise, the way his uncle did everything. No wasted words, no visible emotion, just the architecture of a threat. Return the girls within 24 hours, or the safe house location is forwarded to the Delgado network. He set the phone down on his desk. The Delgado network had been looking for leverage against him for 3 years. A safe house location, with 2 children in it, would be more than leverage. It would be an invitation. He sat in the dark of his office for 11 minutes. Then his phone rang. It was Sora. She was calling from the bathroom of the safe house. He could hear the small, careful way she was breathing, measured, controlled, the way she had learned to do everything. Her voice, when it came, was completely flat, not panicked, just at the absolute end of something. Can you come get me? Please, I can't be here anymore. He answered before the second ring ended. I'm coming. He was already standing, already moving down the hallway toward his car. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His men read the way he moved, and 3 black cars were pulling out of the building's underground garage before he finished putting his coat on. 14 minutes. That was all it took. 14 minutes from her voice in that bathroom to 3 sets of headlights cutting through the Chicago dark toward her address. He had crossed the city in worse conditions for lesser reasons, and told himself it was logistics. This wasn't logistics. When the cars pulled up, Minha was already outside, standing on the front step, coat on, small bag at her feet, like she had packed the moment the threat was sent. Like she had been monitoring the channels long enough to know exactly when Elder Han would move and had simply waited for the confirmation. She looked at Seojun as he stepped out of the car. Her voice was very calm. I knew he would move tonight, she said. He always moves on Thursdays. Lower traffic on the network, fewer people watching. She picked up her bag. I know where everything is, she said. Every account, every route, every name. She looked up at him steadily. I've been memorizing it for 8 months. In case we ever needed to run, she added. Or in case you ever needed to finish it. It took his team 4 days to pull everything. Every surveillance file from every camera on every route the twins had walked over 8 months. Bronzeville, the Loop, the stretch under the L tracks on the north side, where the noise from the trains covered the sound of everything else. The Wabash corridor, the blocks near the port. Night footage mostly, grainy, dark, the kind of footage that city cameras produced when nobody was paying the maintenance budget. Seojun watched it alone. He sent everyone out of the room, and he sat in the dark with 4 monitors, and he watched. He watched 2 tiny figures move through Chicago winter at hours when children were supposed to be asleep. He watched them adjust their routes when something looked wrong ahead. The older one always slightly in front, always the first to read the street, always the one who made the call. He watched the February night when Minha's shoe gave out and they kept walking anyway, 2 miles, and the camera at the intersection caught the way Sora reached over without looking and took her sister's hand and didn't let go. He watched for 4 hours. He didn't move, he didn't make calls, he didn't eat. When it was over, he sat in the dark for a long time. Then, he picked up his phone and called his inner circle. 1 instruction. Set up the boardroom meeting. Every syndicate head in Chicago. No exceptions. Private floor downtown. I'll send the address. A pause on the line. His most trusted lieutenant, a man who had been with him for 12 years and knew better than most when not to ask questions, asked one anyway. What are we telling them this is about? Seojun looked at the frozen frame on the monitor closest to him. The February intersection. 2 small girls. Minha's broken shoe. Sora's hand holding hers, on a street where nobody filed reports and nobody looked up from their windows. "Tell them it's about accountability," he said. "Tell them to bring their lawyers." The room was 40 stories up, floor-to-ceiling glass on the south wall. Chicago spread out below like a circuit board, lit, dense, indifferent. The lake beyond the skyline was black and enormous. The men around the table were the kind of men who made cities look the other way, and tonight they had all shown up because when Seojun called a meeting, not showing up meant something nobody wanted it to mean. He let them sit for 30 seconds after he walked in. 30 seconds of nothing. No greeting, no preamble, just the sound of the city far below and the specific discomfort of powerful men being made to wait by someone they couldn't refuse. Then the footage played. He didn't introduce it, didn't explain it, just let it run. The room watched. 2 tiny figures in Chicago winter. Night footage, route after route. The broken shoe, the hand-holding, the bruises caught briefly on a port camera in a frame nobody was supposed to pull. 8 months of it, compressed, undeniable. Nobody spoke. When it ended, Seojun spoke, quietly, the way he always spoke when the words were meant to stay. "You called them efficient." He wasn't looking at his uncle, he was looking at the room. "I call them children." 3 keystrokes from the man at the laptop beside him, every account tied to Elder Han's network, frozen. Every shell company, every port contract, every subsidiary built over 15 years of careful construction, locked in real time. On the screens around the room, the numbers stopped moving. Elder Han stood. He opened his mouth. The room looked at him and said nothing. Because the room had just seen what he was, clearly, without the benefit of distance or deniability. And Chicago, even this room full of men who had all done their own accounting with their own conscience, did not protect what it could clearly see. He was escorted out. At the door, he stopped beside Seojun, leaned close, voice very low. "You think this makes you different from me?" Not a question. "You were useful before you were loved too, nephew. You just found a prettier reason." He was gone before Seojun could respond. Seojun stood at the window, 40 stories up, the lake black and vast beyond the city. His jaw was locked, because the worst part, the part he stood with in the silence after the room emptied, was that he wasn't completely sure the man was wrong about where he came from, only about where he was going. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly, then all at once. The lake stopped being a threat, the streets dried out. People reappeared on sidewalks like they had been waiting for permission, and the city that had spent 4 months being something to survive became, briefly, something to live in. Minha started asking questions about school, not survival questions, not logistical questions about what documents were required or whether the enrollment would be traceable. Real questions. Whether there would be other kids who liked to read, whether she could take 2 different subjects if she wanted. Small, ordinary, expensive questions. The kind that only made sense if you had decided, quietly and without announcing it, that you were going to be somewhere long enough for the answers to matter. Sora stopped keeping her coat packed. For weeks she had kept it folded on the chair beside her bed. Ready, always ready, the weight of it available at a moment's notice. One morning, Seojun walked past her room and saw it hanging on the hook behind the door. Just hanging there, like a coat. Like it belonged to someone who lived in the place where it was hung. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to get his keys. The Korean bakery on the north side, the one he had driven past for 3 years and never once stopped at, never had a reason, never let himself have the kind of ordinary errand that required being a person instead of a function, he stopped. He went inside. He bought oolong tea and 2 small white boxes of pastries. The woman behind the counter wrapped them without asking questions, and he stood in the warm smell of the place for slightly longer than necessary before he left. When he came home, the girls were at the kitchen table. Homework spread between them. Minha working through something methodical, Sora reading ahead of whatever she was supposed to be doing, one foot tucked under her on the chair the way she had recently started sitting, loose, unguarded, like someone whose body had stopped bracing. He set the bag on the table. Minha looked up, then at the bag, then back at him with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of something that might become ordinary happiness if given enough time and enough mornings like this one. Sora was already opening her box. And then the older twin looked up at him. "Mister, are we still expensive?" He looked at her, at both of them. Minha with her careful eyes and her 8 months of memorized routes and her private negotiations. Sora with her coat on the hook and her foot tucked under her and her slow, hard-won willingness to stop bracing for the next thing. He knelt beside them. Han Seojun, the ghost of Chicago, the man who had built an empire on the principle that love was a resource and not a gift. The man who had sat in a freezing alley one January night and not known the answer to a question that turned out to be the most important one he'd ever been asked. Smiled. For the first time in longer than he could clearly remember. "No," he said. A pause. "You were priceless." The kitchen was warm. The lake glittered somewhere beyond the window. Sora's pastry box crinkled softly in the quiet. And that was enough. That was, for this moment, exactly enough. That night, after the girls were asleep, Seojun sat alone at the kitchen table. His phone lit up. Unknown number. One message. "You took something that belonged to us. The girls aren't the only leverage we had on you. You'll understand soon." He read it once, set the phone face down on the table. Outside, Chicago was warm and quiet for the first time in months. Before we get to the ending, if this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell. There is more coming and you don't want to start in the middle.